On our broadcast tonight, the homecoming. A former president brings home 2 Americans held prisoner by a dictator. Targeting women, a gunman walks into a gym on a weeknight and 4 are dead. Just offshore, what are Russian submarines doing in the waters of the Atlantic? And making a difference, a veteran of the baseball diamond helping to polish up some young diamonds in the rough. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Tonight, 2 American journalists are home after being set free by a North Korean dictator and flown home by a former U.S. president who traveled halfway around the world to get them. It was an emotional homecoming in California for Laura Ling and Yuna Lee. As we learn more tonight now about how this all came together, we begin our coverage this evening with NBC's George Lewis.
Free at last. The 2 journalists briefly savoring their return to America this morning before being mobbed by their families. A poignant moment as Yuna Lee's husband Michael Saldati and 4-year-old daughter Hannah held on to one another for dear life. And a big hand for the former president who secured the release of the 2 women after 5 months in captivity.
We feared that at any moment we could be sent to a hard labor camp. When we walked in through the doors, we saw standing before us President Bill Clinton. We were shocked. But we knew instantly in our hearts that the nightmare of our lives was finally coming to an end.
Throughout the journalists' 140-day ordeal, the families of Laura Ling and Yuna Lee held vigils and tried to raise public awareness about the plight of the 2 women.
We could feel your love all the way in North Korea. It is what kept us going in the darkest of hours. It is what sustained our faith that we would come home.
I can't even describe what my whole body went through when I saw her. It was just really powerful and emotional.
The 2 women work for Current TV, a channel started by former Vice President Al Gore.
We want to welcome Laura and Yuna home.
Among those across the country watching the emotional homecoming, President Obama.
The reunion that we've all seen on television, I think, is a source of happiness not only for the families but for the entire country.
A source of happiness that the families continue to enjoy tonight. Here at Laura Ling's home, her family says she's going to need a few days to decompress. Both she and Yuna Lee are expected to have more to say about their time in North Korea in the coming weeks. Brian?
George Lewis in L.A. for us tonight. George, thanks. The backstory to all this, how it all actually happened, came together, is a big part of it, partly because it wasn't this nation's diplomat-in-chief who pulled this off. In this case, it was her husband, the former president. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, has that part of the story tonight from Nairobi, where she is traveling with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who spoke today about her husband's unusual role in this whole drama. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Tonight, an amazing diplomatic suspense story involving months of delicate negotiations and several teams of former political rivals. From the moment the news broke that the 2 women were arrested, accused of crossing the North Korean border.
2 American journalists detained by North Korea.
The Obama administration sprang into action, along with the women's employer, Current TV founder Al Gore. The Swedish ambassador, who represents the U.S. in Pyongyang, took messages and medicine to the prisoners. U.S. diplomats met with North Korea's ambassador to the UN. Gore and the State Department called the families every day. Hillary Clinton met with them on May 11th. North Korea didn't make it easy. A missile test in April, a nuclear test in May. More missiles fired on July 4th.
And I strongly condemn their reckless action.
Then on June 8th, Yuna Lee and Laura Ling were sentenced to 12 years of hard labor. But a glimmer of hope. They remained in a guest house, still able to call their families. The U.S. proposed sending an envoy, most likely Al Gore. Others on the list, New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson and Senator John Kerry. But in July, the women called their families and said the North Koreans wanted Bill Clinton. He wasn't even on the White House list. Some said for good reason, after some of his comments about candidate Obama during the 2008 campaign.
Give me a break. This whole thing is the biggest fairy tale I've ever seen.
Al Gore told the White House the North Koreans wanted Clinton. President Obama gave the go-ahead.
The White House reached out, as they said, to my husband to ask him if he'd be willing to do that.
It was now a team of rivals, one better, President Obama and two Clintons. The final step, if Bill Clinton were to go, would it be a done deal? The North Koreans messaged yes, and the wheels were in motion. And those wheels were pretty fancy. A private 737 owned by Clinton friend and Hollywood producer Stephen Bing. Former Clinton Chief of Staff John Podesta went along to file the paperwork for the pardon in a North Korean court. Hours later, Yoona Lee and Laura Ling were heading home. As for our team of rivals, the president called Bill Clinton today, their first conversation since the mission began, to say that he did a great job. And the White House says the two men will get together. They didn't say when. Brian?
Andrea Mitchell in Nairobi tonight with the Secretary of State. Andrea, thanks. This next story in this country broke after we were off the air last night. It happened in Pennsylvania. A man carrying 4 guns opened fire on an exercise class full of women, killing 3, injuring 9 before turning one of those weapons on himself. And it turns out he told the world about his plans before he pulled it off. NBC's Mike Taibbi is in Bridgeville, PA, just outside Pittsburgh tonight. Mike, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. You know, this might have been a year in the planning. A lonely, bitter man brings a duffel bag stuffed with handguns and ammunition to a health club, not to attack any one woman, but to shoot indiscriminately at a random group of women because of what he describes in a bitter, unusual blog as decades of rejection. 48-year-old George Sedini had a decent job as a law firm systems analyst in a nice house in a quiet Pittsburgh neighborhood. But he also had what police described as
we're going to miss her dearly.
3 of those injured are still listed in serious condition, but all are expected to survive. By the way, police say that Sedini did have all the proper permits to own and to carry the handguns he so tragically misused last night. Right?
Such a scary story from that Pittsburgh suburb tonight. Mike Taibbi with our report. Mike, thanks. President Obama returned today to Elkhart, Indiana. The economy has been brutal to Elkhart. In fact, the journalists of our website, msnbc.com, have been documenting life in Elkhart for months. Unemployment is nearly 17% there, and the president's visit today was designed at least to bring some good news there about jobs. Our chief White House correspondent Chuck Todd spent some time with the president on the factory floor. He is with us from that community tonight. Chuck, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Well, as you described, of all the hard-hit places, Elkhart, Indiana is the barometer by which President Obama believes he will be and should be judged on his ability to turn around the economy.
We will be #1 again when it comes
With 1 out of 6 Elkhart adults still out of work, our website, msnbc.com, is tracking the recession and potential recovery through the eyes of this hard-hit community, and so is the president.
Let me show you the front page of the Elkhart Truth.
Right.
Clearly your presidency now might be, how's it playing in Elkhart? And
right.
They believe your fortunes here of the community and a president entwined. Is that fair?
Absolutely. But the most important thing we're going to have to do is to help Elkhart reinvent itself. If I'm successful at the end of 4 years, I'll be able to look back and say Elkhart's not just come back from the brink, but is actually poised to move forward in the 21st century.
And I would like to know what...
The president also responded to questions I read to him from MSNBC.com by Elkhart residents, like Jennifer Holderreed.
Why instead of...
Jennifer Holderreed, here's what she says right here from Elkhart. Why are big businesses coming in ahead of the people of this country?
When people think about how government spend its money, what's gotten a lot of publicity is the banks, the auto companies, and that's something that people don't see concrete effects. So it's our job to make sure they know that almost everything we're doing right now is designed to stabilize the economy, but also to make sure that ordinary people have some relief.
Unemployment nationally is expected to rise this week, so the president hinted he may extend unemployment benefits yet again.
We've got to make sure that there's still a safety net for folks in place when the unemployment numbers come out, I think we'll have to evaluate this very carefully.
The real challenge for the president, selling comfort and patience to people who just want a job and still can't find one, like Howard Mishler.
What do you tell these folks that are in their 40s and 50s that their jobs might not come back?
Listen, I wish I had a magic wand and I could, deal with this extraordinary crisis in a matter of weeks, but I can't. It took us years to get into the problems that we're in. It's going to take us some years to get out, but I'm confident we will.
Now, Brian, the president did make some news that's going to raise some eyebrows on Capitol Hill. He indicated to me that he's losing patience with these negotiations with Republicans when it comes to health care. And when September rolls around and Congress comes back from their vacation, he may be ready to do this on a total party line vote. It could really polarize Congress, but he wants to get health care done. Brian.
All right, Chuck Todd on the RV factory floor in Elkhart County, Indiana. Chuck, thanks. When our broadcast continues along the way for a Wednesday night, the former congressman and the case of the cash in the freezer. Tonight, a verdict in that high-profile bribery trial. And later, he made a splash on the baseball diamond. These days, he's making a difference in the lives of some very grateful kids. We are back now with the case of the cold, hard cash, money that was famously found in the freezer at the home of William Jefferson, now a former congressman from Louisiana. Tonight, there is a verdict in his criminal trial. Our justice correspondent, Pete Williams, at federal court in Alexandria, Virginia tonight. Pete, good evening.
Brian, this verdict comes 4 years after the FBI watched Congressman Jefferson outside a Washington hotel accept a briefcase stuffed with $100,000 in cash. The jury found him guilty of planning to use that money to bribe officials in Africa who are willing to help U.S. companies in which Jefferson's family had an interest. $90,000 of that money was found in his kitchen, in his freezer, wrapped in foil packets and hidden in frozen food containers. The jury also found him guilty today of taking bribes from other companies to help them do business in Africa. He could face a long prison term. He'll be sentenced in October, Brian.
Pete Williams in Alexandria, Virginia for us tonight. Pete, thanks. One of the most emailed stories on the entire New York Times website tonight has to do with a hot topic wherever two people sleep together, and that is, should the bedroom be warm or cold for sleeping? It turns out the ideal temperature, this is science here, for sleep is actually pretty cool, between 60 and 68 degrees. Hope we're watching at home. So people who have a hard time falling asleep might benefit from turning the AC up or the heat down. It's what the experts are saying. I'm just saying. When Nightly News continues in a moment, it's not quite the Russians are coming, but are those Russian subs off the East Coast? The Cold War is over after all, so what gives? The cement blast walls that have transformed the city of Baghdad during the war years are coming down. They'll be gone in just over a month. The Iraqi government made the announcement today. Most of the walls, ubiquitous in that city, were put up by the U.S. military to reduce violence, but they divided up that city and they cut neighborhoods apart. They were ugly reminders of the worst days of the fighting. A report surfaced this week that Russian submarines have been discovered just about 200 miles off the east coast of the United States. These sorts of submarine games were commonplace back during the Cold War. Both superpowers did it, but why now? Our report tonight from our Pentagon correspondent, Jim Miklaszewski.
In a startling throwback to the Cold War, and for the first time in 20 years, two Russian nuclear-powered attack submarines like these have been lurking off the U.S. East Coast. The two Akula-class subs have been patrolling in international waters this week, about 200 miles offshore. Although submerged, they were easily detected and tracked by U.S. Navy warships and sensors on the ocean floor. Though the appearance of the Russian subs came as a complete surprise, the Pentagon today played down any potential threat.
So while it is interesting and noteworthy that they are in this part of the world, it doesn't pose any threat.
A far cry from the perilous days when the cat-and-mouse games between U.S. and Russian subs were the stuff of Hollywood. Including a classic Cold War spoof, The Russians Are Coming.
The Russians have landed. They're here.
But following the Cold War, the Soviets' conventional military, broken and out of cash, fell into serious disrepair. Entire fleets of Russian warships were abandoned to rust in port. When the Russian Navy... Jim Miklashevsky, NBC News, the Pentagon.
At Arlington National Cemetery in Washington today, they commemorated what's been called the other D-Day. August 15th will mark the 65th anniversary of Operation Dragoon. It was the Allied invasion of southern France. 2 months after the Normandy invasion in World War II, 900 ships, 1,300 landing craft, just as many bombers, almost 100,000 combined troops. They blasted a backdoor to France, in effect, and they sped up the liberation of Europe. They took over 100,000 German prisoners along the way. About 35 of the surviving veterans of that great campaign were on hand at Arlington today. Up next, a man with glory days on the diamond now making a difference in some troubled young lives.
Week after week, Meet the Press follows the issues challenging top newsmakers to explain and defend their positions. For more than 60 years, you've relied on us to be fair and to get it right every Sunday morning. This is the tradition of NBC News.
Making a Difference. Brought to you by GlaxoSmithKline. Today's medicines, tomorrow's miracles.
And it's time for tonight's Making a Difference segment. It's about a man who retired from a high-profile career on the baseball diamond to help young people who badly need direction and need to know that somebody cares about them. Our own Lee Cowan has the story from the California desert.
We can't show you their faces because they're wards of the state, an uncomfortable label for the abandoned and abused boys who end up in Hot Springs, California.
And that is our broadcast for this Wednesday night. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams. We, of course, hope to see you right back here tomorrow night. Good night.